Okay, good morning and welcome to our class. Maybe I should say at the beginning, this is March 4th, 2025, and we are continuing our discussion of sexual harassment. We've been looking at some biblical sources, which we continue to do today. And in addition, as we go along, we'll not only look at some biblical sources, we'll look at some both modern examples, some sad examples in the modern world and modern synagogue life, as well as how different groups within the Jewish world have tried to establish boundaries and tried to establish ethical codes that apply to relationships within synagogue. And it's an interesting question because often we see relationships between clergy and congregants, but there's also the question, of course, congregants to congregants, which is also be something that we will be discussing this morning. Last week, we discussed a couple of biblical examples. I I skipped a few of the texts about those biblical examples, so I want to go back and start this week looking at some of those texts, which I think illuminate how the Bible sees some of these examples. Again, we recognize that the ancient texts may or may not be helpful in discussing the values of our society. Sometimes the ancient text, of course, going to be reflective of a patriarchal society, and we are going to question how they look at things. Okay, so let us begin. I'm going to share the screen with, see, let me see, let me get off. Number 6. Okay. Okay. I can make it even bigger. Can everybody see that? Good size?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just do one thing over here to get, there we go. I want to be sure I got everybody on the side there. Okay. Very good. Okay. We did look at the story of Dinah last week, but here's a modern take on it. As you recall, the question is, when the story begins, we read that Dinah, the only daughter of Jacob, she, quote, goes out and she is raped by Shechem, one of the son of one of the princes of the area. And some of the questions that we're going to see here, this is written by Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, who dean of the rabbinical school. Is she still dean of the rabbinical school? I don't remember. Yeah, I think she is. That has changed over the years. Yes, she is still dean of the rabbinical school. This was just written fairly recently. Oh, here it is, 2003. And notice she says, remember, Dinah, listen to women. The two of the things we saw in the traditional telling of the story, one, Dinah is silent, right? Dinah doesn't say anything. And we have very few actual verses where we hear about what she did or did not do. We hear about her brothers who avenge what happened, but we don't hear too much from her. And we're going to see how a modern rabbi takes a look at the story and tries to understand it in somewhat, excuse me, in some different ways. Okay, and she actually begins, Rabbi Cohen begins one of the most horrifying phenomenon, the aftermath of October 7th, is the attempt to erase and deny the brutal sexual violence that Hamas perpetrated that day against Israeli girls and women. As you may know that in certain circles, unfortunately and horribly, that reality was not reflected and was ignored, right? To ignore the violence perpetrated against Israeli women is to erase their experience. So now we have a biblical example of violence against women. How do we look at that, right? Dinah's story is often overlooked in this Torah portion by Yishlach. So, okay. She's a singular character in Genesis, the only named daughter born to Jacob. Her existence is somewhat a paradox. Her whole story is contained in 2 verses. What she does, what we hear about her, is in 2 verses. The rest of the story is about her brothers, her father, and the city of Shechem, and what they do and what happens. Okay. Now, the verse that we begin the story is very simple, we would say. Vatetse Dina bat Leah asher yalda liYaakov lirot bivnot haaretz. Now Dina, the daughter of Leah, again, we're reading this biblically. Every detail is there, perhaps for a reason. In other words, this is not new information. Of course, she is the daughter of Leah, and of course, her father is Jacob. Why bother telling us in this story in the Bible about that? If I said, "Oh, let me tell you a story about I don't know, one of the children of John F. Kennedy, right? John F. Kennedy Jr. He was the son of John F. Kennedy, right? And Jacqueline Kennedy. Well, did I need to tell you that? And also, in terms of what Dina did or did not do, right? There's one verb. Actually, not only is there one verb, but not in the Hebrew, not in the English, but in the Hebrew, it's the first word of the sentence, right? Vatetse, went out, right? Lirot, second verb, lirot, to see or to visit, bivnot haaretz, the daughters of the land, whatever that means. Now, we had before some of the commentaries that says, oh, it's like taking a piece of meat out outside your tent and the birds start grabbing it. In other words, Dina is someone who did something where she is at fault. She, by going out, was going to, she was attacked and raped by Shechem. Well, she shouldn't have gone out. Blame the woman. We saw those, and yes, those do exist. We saw that in the Midrash, that very specific one. And they talk about the going out, and there is an attempt to see it in a negative term. And so now we have, why is she named this way? Rashi, citing several midrashim, emphasized that she is an inherited and undesirable characteristic of Leah. Why tell us that she's Leah's daughter? Because what's going to happen to her, that also happened to Leah, and it tells us about her character, right? Right. Leah went out to meet Jacob and uses the same verb to seduce him with mandrakes, right? That she without going into the detail, the bottom line is we have the similar verb, use it in the case of her mother, and she went out, and the intention was to have a sexual relation with her husband in exchange for these mandrakes, okay? This is in contrast to Sarah and Rebecca, who traditionally stayed in their tents. And the Midrash actually brings those phrases about them staying in their tents, all right? And then why else? To draw the connection to Dina's brothers, Shimon and Levi, right? Why tell us she's Leah's daughter? Well, because so are Shimon and Levi, and Shimon and Levi, we know, are going to avenge what happens. The focus is then diverted to her brother's vengeance. By mentioning Leah, we're now really not talking about Dina anymore. We're talking about her brothers, okay? We never hear from Dina again. An important point. She says nothing in the text of the Bible, right? Now she's going to bring from a modern interpretation from a book called the Yershuni Contemporary Women's Midrash, okay? She says, well, the Midrash is limited. Women's lives and women's agency were understood through a very narrow lens. Mistaken understandings of God's will and intention. This is not what God truly wants. It's a very dramatic and forceful statement. Okay, so how do we discern God in Dina's story? Where is God in Dina's story? Not very,
God is silent.
Right. God doesn't say hey, Levi and Shimon, go out and kill the guys, right? We don't read that. Hey, Dina, you did something wrong. God said to Jacob, your daughter Dina did something wrong. We don't have that. Okay, so she points out that Abravanel, who says, claiming the comparison to Leah is meant as praise. Now, how do we get there? The traditional, all the commentaries, the Midrash says it's negative. She went out and she should have known better. Going out, she's asking for it. That's the basic, right? She's asking for it. If it is Dina's going out, which likens her to Leah, so this is a commentary, Rivka Lubitch, suggests it is referring to going out for an act of a mitzvah. Oh, her mother went out to have sex with Jacob. Why? Because she wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of Peru or Revu, of having children. And going out was not to display yourself and become an object, but rather it was for of a mitzvah. Like her father. By the way, what did her father do? Where did he live? When did he go out? When did he leave home? Remember when her father left home? Yeah, Rini?
I had to unmute after Asa when he took Asa's birth. Well, Rifla tricked him. He had to leave.
Right, because what was Asaph about? What did Asaph want to do? Kill him.
Yeah.
Right. So going out is not necessarily just because we have a going out. We don't have to make that going out into a negative term. All right. She went out to see the daughters, as it says, either friendship or death. Now that's quoting another Talmudic passage, which is used often in praise of friendship. Dinah was isolated. How many sisters did she have? Well, as far as we know, none. Right? She's growing up with all the brothers, so she felt a little lonely. She didn't have anyone, no other female companion. The only sister among the brothers went out seeking friendship among the women of the land. Notice the verse itself says, Lirot bivnot haaretz. The verse itself can support that interpretation because it didn't say she went out to, to see the guys. She didn't go out to a singles bar. She didn't go out to sell something. She didn't go out to admire the scenery. She went out lirot bivnot haaretz. So that interpretation is not so foreign to the Hebrew in the verse, okay? This is another question. Why was she quiet? Why was she silent? Dina was a quiet person and had no voice. Why to such an extent? Because the members of her household did not listen to her and didn't engage her in conversation. That doesn't sound, now if we're looking at it from a different perspective, oh yeah, she's the only female there, and so they're ignoring her. And because she's being ignored, she has learned not to say anything. Again, the way that we are seeing is trying to reduce the emphasis on blaming the victim.
Rabbi, there's something confusing here. It says, do not engage in excessive conversation with a woman.
Right. That's a Talmudic quote.
I look at it being any conversation.
Oh, any conversation. Well, all I can say is that this is what the rabbinic quote is. The rabbinic quote, again, we look at it and we can say, is that a value that stands as something that God wants always to be in effect, or is that something that is a reflection of the society that they're living in, right? Do not engage in excessive conversation with a woman. Don't spend a lot of time talking. Why wouldn't you talk a lot to a woman? What's the assumption?
They're unlearned.
Yeah, it's a waste of time. What do they know? What can they say? What sort of intelligence do they have? You're wasting your time, right? And that's a time when you get a society in which this is a value, you could understand, patriarchal society as it was.
Does it mean any conversation? I mean, where do
Well, it
you?
says excessive conversation. I guess you can ask what's for dinner. I mean, I don't,
I don't know what they mean by excessive.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. There may be some interpretations about that, but it seems to be, for whatever reason, in whatever topic, it does seem to say minimize your interaction with females. Minimize. And then it should not be surprising that females living in such a society don't say very much because they know they're not going to be listened to. Doesn't matter what they say. They're going to be ignored. And the men around them are going to avoid their conversation. So to say that Dina was silent, are we blaming Dina? Or are we saying that is a reflection of how and where she was living? Okay. And that is why she went out to see the daughters of the land. She had nobody to talk to. Yeah, Rini.
Well, I think even in modern times, many women are hesitate to go to the police or speak after a rape because they're so ashamed and embarrassed. And in society, they are blamed. What were you wearing? What were why were you?
Well, right. And
So I don't think, I don't think her behavior is unusual. I think her behavior is what women are still doing, many women.
right. Well, and obviously Rabbi Cohn are bringing these commentaries for exactly that point, that women are, first of all, they're afraid they're not going to be believed. They blame themselves because they are often seen as in this case, Dina went out like a piece of meat out to the marketplace and the birds started pecking at it. Gee, what do you expect? So that the Midrash is saying that, and we're saying, don't blame Dina for not speaking out. She has been taught all her life that whatever she has to say doesn't matter. Again, without seeing anything in the text that interpretation is consistent with what we see in the text. Okay. Dina was like a mute, as it says, and Dina went out to see. She's even making it further. Dina didn't go out to have a conversation. Dina just wanted to look around because she's so used to not speaking. Right? This is her way of being. So the text could have said, Dina went out to have a conversation with the daughters of the land. No, she went out to see the daughters of the land. Right? So this is almost rabbinic, right? We're reading the text very closely and taking hints from the text itself to make conclusions. And the Bible very often, as we know, does not give us a full explanation of inner thought processes and motivations. It's not the nature of the biblical narrative to do that. Okay, Rini.
I have a question. Before, when you read that Dina was compared with Leah, could it also be that they mentioned her lineage, her parents, as a way of showing she was of a high stature, so that that when she was raped, it was more of an event than if some lowly woman went out and.
Well, that's bad, and that's also pretty bad, isn't it? In other
Well,
words,
yeah, I know, but they specifically mentioned, like.
Well, it's the story of the patriarchs. So I mean, we're reading their stories.
Oh, okay. I was
But
just
what
curious.
you're pointing to is that does the biblical culture have different levels of concern for rape depending upon the social status of the victim?
Right.
Could
That's
be.
what
I mean, we're all we have here is, of course, the story of the patriarchs, and we also have some king. So we'll get to the royal family later. But yeah, that one would imagine in that society that was probably true as well. We I don't know how much evidence we might have of that, right? It's a sort of thing that we would not expect to be in whatever sources that we have left. Okay. Is it conceivable that she did not? And okay, what's more, it says he betted her and abused her. It does not say, and Dina cried out, right? Isn't it conceivable that she did not? But it's as if she were mute. Out of pain and the shame, she hushed up and fell silent, right? Which is what we see today very often for victims of rape. Perhaps this is one more way that Dina took after her father, as the sages, as another commentary says, how is it possible that Dina's father Jacob was silent after she was raped? That's a good question. And again, we have to say, wow, was this, was she like was her father not one who complained when he saw terrible things? I don't know. I mean, we just don't know. Okay. And she points out to what happened after October 7th. Those in the international community who would deny the sexual violence inflicted on that day are willfully averting their eyes to further their own agenda at the expense of Israeli women. Okay. This is a side issue, but it's worth mentioning here because it does reflect some of these questions of how much women are heard. And I have heard I heard once a speaker for the Israeli government, frankly, ignore this next fact. Another group of Israeli women, the Tatzpaniot, the spotters, who a group of them were recently freed, were hostages, the ones that were left alive, right? These young women soldiers who was consistently surveyed, repeatedly reported deeply concerning observations that they asserted were Hamas training for incursions against Israel. They were ignored and overlooked. So again, this issue, when we're talking about women's role and place and harassment, they were not taken seriously. Recently, actually just last week, there was a preliminary report that was made of Israeli government, which, well, we won't go into this, but there's another issue, many issues here about how the Israeli government is investigating exactly why what happened on October 7th happened. But one of the issues were that young women soldiers reporting activity by Hamas why were they ignored? Because they were women, they were young women, and the intelligence organizations did not take them seriously. Is this surprising even today in the Israeli army as opposed to ancient times, right? Right? Listening to their brave and insistent voices will necessitate an important reckoning on the climate for women in the Israeli army. Okay. Right? Women are silenced, blamed, and forgotten, right? Blaming Dina for her rape or obscuring her story conceals the face of God. As painful as uncomfortable as the story of Dina is, we must not ignore, shy away from it, grapple with the text. We must recognize that we see more of the story and more of the face of God when we see every member of the community. What is she saying? The tendency to be blind to what women do and say. In the name of Dina, as Israeli women give testimony, we must listen, recount their stories, and must amplify their voices. So here she's reading the story of Dina as reflective of the underlying values of that society, which diminished the voice of women, saw them as victims, and did not hear anything. And as women became accustomed to not being heard, it's no wonder they were silent. So some of these values, we're still trying to overcome some of these when we're going to be talking about, what happens in Jewish life and in synagogue life with harassment of women. Okay. Any question, comment about this article by Rabbi Cohen? No. Okay. So let's go along to, let me just take a look at the story. Okay, 6a. Now, this source, share screen. Now, we did take a look at the story of Tamar last week. But again, I want to take a deeper look into the story of Tamar. And again, this is from a feminist view. It's called from the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. You can find it on the internet. Again, when we talk about the traditional Mefarshim, the traditional interpreters of the Torah, up until very recently, we're all talking about men, right? There's no, we have Rashi, we have Nachmanides, we have Ibn Ezra, Ravenel, we have all all the classics, but they're all men. Not surprising worldwide. This is nothing unusual, right? But what happens when women start looking at these stories? Well, we just saw a good example, which is very important for our understanding of modern examples of harassment in women's voices. When we take a look at the story of Dinah from a slightly different, the perspective of a feminist lens. Now, the story of Tamar, this is the story of Tamar in the book of Second Samuel. We did take a look at it, remember? The daughter of King, story of the rape of Tamar by Amnon, her half-brother, is told in the wake of the king's sins of adultery and murder. When Tamar attends Amnon, who feigns illness, he seizes her, rapes her, and then banishes from the room. The only woman whom we hear voicing resistance to rape, right? Dinah, we don't hear. Tamar does talk, okay? She is silenced in the end by her full brother, Avshalom, who, as you probably know, doesn't meet a good end either, and lives the rest of her life forlorn in his house. He then enacts vengeance on her rape, murdering Amnon. They're the rape again. But again, just as with Dinah, there is revenge taken about the rape and staging an insurrection against his father, the king. David is strongly implicated in his daughter's rape, passively indulgent of his sons. Where have we seen that before, right? There are some consistent themes, just as we saw with Jacob. Jacob is not the one to take up arms. His sons do. And when they kill everyone, then afterwards, Jacob says, this is not good for us. People around are going to hear about this, and this is really bad. And then the sons say to Jacob, but what are we supposed to do? Our sister was raped. And Jacob does not answer that final question. So here too, King David does not, who mirror and amplify the sins of the father. Okay, so I'm going to, though she remains muted and desolate in her brother's household afterwards, never to marry or bear children. But she's the only woman whose voice is heard aloud in protest to rape in the Hebrew Bible. There are more than a few rapes in the Hebrew Bible. So let's take a look at how someone, a modern feminist view of this question of women's role and what women do. Okay. All right. The rape of Tamar, right? In all three rape narratives in the Bible, the story of Dinah, which we took a look at, the concubine of Gibeah, I'm not going to go into that story, and Amnon and Tamar, the father is subtly implicated in his daughter's violation because of his own prior actions. At the outset of the story, Amnon is sick with love for Tamar because she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. His wise and crafty friends, they suggest, fake illness, ask Tamar to bring you some food. She comes in. She prepares heart-shaped cakes, levav levivot. Amnon sends all the servants out, forcibly takes hold and says, come lie with me. Now, Tamar, this is where it's interesting. She says, no, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrage. And the word that's used for outrage is nevela. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be one of the scoundrels, same Hebrew root, nevelim. Now, therefore, now this is a little peculiar here. Now, therefore, I beg you, speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. It's a little odd what she's trying to say there, right? We'll take a look at that sentence and try to understand what it is. Again, the biblical text isn't giving us insight as to her motivation and what she's thinking. And we might say for a second, wait a second, she is protesting, but she's saying that, oh, just ask your dad and it'll be okay. Okay.
Bizarre.
A little odd, right? But see how this reading goes. Tamar warns Amnon that if he were to do this outrage, a term associated with the collective shame carried by the violated woman's body, he would be like one of the scoundrels. Furthermore, despite the incest taboo, Tamar suggests that the king would grant her to Abdon in marriage if he were to ask. Right? That's peculiar. It's very peculiar. Whether she would have been permissible to him as his half-sister is questionable. It's pretty clear in other books of the Bible that this is not a permissible relationship. But at this point, her argument seems to arise from sheer desperation. The king is inserted here as an alibi, a bid for time and pause of conscience in the violent passion. How am I going to stop this guy from doing this? I got an idea. Maybe if I say to him, let's just wait, it'll be okay. The king will say, okay, he'll stop now. So the reading, which is again of this peculiar statement, is actually somewhat we could say to Tamar's as a positive. She is complaining. She is the one woman who we see complain. She wants to be listened to, but she comes up with a statement that she hopes will stop. Okay, but he doesn't. So, and then there is some interesting results. After Tamar is raped, well, I'm sorry, there we are. Amnon is seized with hatred. His loathing was even greater than his lust he had felt for her, and he orders her out with two callous words: "Up, go." Despite her request not to shame her further in this way, he commands his servant to send this one out. She becomes an object, right? The woman is reduced to the demonstrative pronoun this. Again, we see that in these cases of rape, women's individuality, women's personality she's an object, a thing. When she ceases to satisfy, she is cast away. Amnon's banishment is worse than sexual violation, for Tamar has little recourse. She's a victim of rape and revulsion by the king's son. According to the law, the one who seduces or rapes a virgin out of wedlock must pay the bride price and marry her, and he may never divorce her. While incest may preclude this option, the prince's loathing for the rape victim seals her faith. She's thrown out. In response, Tamar tears the long-sleeved coat, ketonet pasim. That should sound familiar. Characteristic of the virgin daughters of the king, the rendering of the cloak foreshadows the rent in the kingdom. And who else has a ketonet pasim? Joseph. Now, we often translate it as his multicolored cloak, right? I mean, there are songs about it. It really is very dramatic. But in point of fact, we're not 100% sure what a ketonet pasim really is. It may have just been a long sleeve. We're just not sure. But what we are clear about is it's mentioned here. It's mentioned in the story of Joseph. And it's probably characteristic of virgin daughters of the king. So what happens? She becomes a person. She puts ashes on her head, tears her garment. But Absalom, her full brother, suggested that nothing could be done to restore her honor. Tamar lives out the rest of her life forlorn in her brother's house. So she is punished. Who gets punished here? Initially, the victim, right? Again, we see this pattern. The king does not punish Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. Again, the father does not defend the daughter.
Rabbi, right? What does forlorn connote or denote?
Forlorn. I mean, she's unhappy. She's, I don't know, upset for the rest of her life about this. It's an emotional reaction to it, right? But then 2 years later, Absalom her brother has Amnon killed. And then Absalom goes into exile, and ultimately, Absalom's suppression of his sister's crime may enable him to plot revenge, but it denies her the right to testify to her own violation and reinforces her shame and banishment from the social order. Though she remains in desolation in her brother's household, she's the only woman who voices resistance to sexual violation, continues to present a powerful example of protest. And of course, an interesting fact, she is further granted an afterlife in that Avshalom names his beautiful daughter Tamar, presumably after her sister. In other words, so we do have at least one example of a woman, but again, we have that same pattern. The father doesn't protest. Yes, and only later on is there any sort of justice taken on the perpetrator. Okay. Questions or comments on this example? Okay, let's go on. Let's stop the share. And one more. Okay, we did look at Purim last week also. So I also wanted to add some questions. So wait a second. So who's the heroine? Is Vashti or Esther the heroine?
Vashti.
What's the case? What's the case for either one? What's the case for making Vashti the heroine? What's the case for making Esther the heroine?
Vashti, because she refuses to kowtow to the king.
Right? Okay, that's one of a rare example of a woman refusing a king's request. So therefore, she in certainly recent times, as we'll see in this article, she has been seen as a heroine. Again, a woman whose voice to object to what to the harassment of a male is faced with she is banished, but she stands up, right? She says no. Okay, and how is Esther the heroine?
Saving the people. Saves.
Okay,
Save
Rini?
people's lives.
Yeah, what she does, of course, note, in order to do so, what does Esther have to do? She has to submit to the king.
Right.
She has to, but later on, she stands up. So it's an interesting question, again, about women and their power, and are they listened to, and who is the real heroine? And here's a commentary from Rabbi Tamara Cohn.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I was just going to say Vashti could also be a heroine because by being banished by the king, she made room for Esther, who learned what not to do. And if Vashti had still been there, who knows what would have happened. So you could look at it both ways.
Okay, so had Vashti not been banished for defying the king, then the king's advisors would not have said to the king, "Ah, this is terrible. All the women in town are going to do terrible things. Then I can listen to their husbands. You got to get a new queen, get rid of her," and the story goes from there. Had Vashti said, "Oh, sure, you want it? I'll show up." By the way, you remember some of the commentaries we were looking at gave Vashti even more emphasis that she was holding a party for the women, and she was as interested in having some wild parties as the king was. So there's some attempt to make them equivalent. With what this commentary does, again, this question of women's role and are they acted upon or do they act, and how that affects the way that they are treated, right, is part of, again, what we're looking at. And this article just is called Taking Back Purim, and says we are challenging ourselves to move beyond the dichotomy of bad queen, good queen, and good feminist and bad feminist, and embrace a wider spectrum of possibility for women's leadership, right? For much of Jewish interpretive tradition, Vashti was the bad queen and Esther was the good one, right? Before we get to fairly recent times, within my lifetime, even shorter than that, there was this attempt to say, Vashti, was not the bad queen. In the early days of Jewish feminism, Vashti was resurrected in celebration for a defiance of the king and her powerful defense of her body and sexuality. I'm not showing up naked, right? That was the pattern. Not surprisingly, as Vashti's popularity grew, Esther fell out of favor, right? Esther became a negative symbol who used their sexuality, enjoy their beauty, fear confrontation, right? Initially, she just goes along. Why didn't she say to Mordecai, it's not such a nice thing for me to go out and get married and to be part of the harem of the king? Why didn't she just say why didn't Esther say to Mordecai what Vashti said to the king? Not what I'm going to do, right? Okay. And remain married to power. These interpretations of Esther minimized her courage in directly confronting both Ahasuerus and Haman. I would add, she was very nice. She could have also questioned Mordecai. And in coming out as a Jew after years of hiding her identity, right? Oh, you're a Jew, right? It's like, we go, oh, look, that Oscar winner, is a Jew. Oh, we didn't know that, or that person, right? There's more than once do we find out that somebody was a Jew who we're not aware about, right? They also ignore Esther's role as an innovator of communal ritual action in her calling for a public fast, right? So that she's acting as a leader, right? We hope to move away from the paradigms of good girl, bad girl, and good feminist, bad feminist to explore the relationship between Esther and Vashti and all they've come to symbolize it, right? Vashti is not evil like Haman or a fool like Ahasuerus. She's a non-Jewish woman who, because of her own suffering at the hands of the more powerful, has much in common with both Mordecai and Esther, and therefore serve on a narrative and symbolic level as a teacher, model, and ally. So here they're saying, yes, there's a lot of positives in Vashti, but we also cannot forget Esther, that it is Esther who asks the king for additional day on which Jews can kill their enemies. Yeah, that's the part of the book of Esther that's not translated. I get those little books. You come to services on Purim, look at the little booklets, and note that in some of the latter chapters, there's a lot of Hebrew and very little English. Why? Because those translations don't remind us that what happened was that Jews went out and defended themselves and killed a lot of the Persians. Right? The armed forces, together with the women and children, we must challenge ourselves to find a way to celebrate Esther's power without necessarily endorsing the violence she authorizes. That is again, there are many ways to look at the book of Esther. And I think, as I mentioned, it is not a historical document. It is most likely a satirical novella. And as a satirical novella, it talks about things which A, never really happened, and B, exaggerates certain things. Just to make it clear, no woman who was Jewish would have married the king, even if she had hidden it. It just would not have happened, right? So in the story of Esther, when we read, and it's a difficult text because the Jews take vengeance on the Persians. Also, there's this thing that when the king makes an announcement, it cannot be stopped, right? In other words, there are several times in the story of Esther we read about the king saying something. Well, he said it. We can't reverse it. It's impossible, which also sounds a little satiric as well. Okay. Perhaps this is another reason for pairing of Esther and Vashti. Once we link the stories of this Jewish and non-Jewish queen, we are on the way to recognizing the linked fates of their people. When we unite Esther, who ends up as a powerful queen, with Vashti, who by the end of the story is absent and therefore powerless, we can begin to grasp the necessity of balancing the need to exercise power and the need to share it. So she's trying to say there are different models of feminine leadership. It is time to make room for our myths in our communities for more than one model of leadership. Time to learn from Esther and Vashti, Jewish women and non-Jewish women. It's time to celebrate women's power and to question the ways we have wielded it over others. And that's a good question. We've been talking about women being harassed, but let's also talk about how women use power and see that also in a positive way. Okay. Comments or questions there? All right. I want to now move to modern times. And by moving to modern times, we're going to start with this document. It's an article I found that was written 2 years ago. Yes, it was in Tikkun magazine. And yes, I know Tikkun magazine is very much on the left liberal side of Jewish life. Okay, fine. But the question that this raises, and here's the question, how well in modern times now, let's move to modern times, do synagogues deal with accusations of harassment? Now, this is specifically between congregants. We'll later on look at issues with clergy, but this is very specifically with a real story in a real conservative synagogue of real people who were harassed. Now, in general, I mean, ideally, what would you expect? If a congregant A says to clergy B, Mr. C is harassing me, what would you expect? Well, or brings to the leadership. What do you expect to see happen? Yeah, Rini?
I would hope that somebody would do something, either speak to that congregant, or if it's, goes up, if speak to them at least, and if it's really true, ask them to leave the synagogue.
Speak, investigate, take action, right?
Right.
Why would that not happen?
I don't know. It's beyond me. I don't know.
Why do you think that might not happen? Yeah, Carol?
They would think it's possibly made up.
Okay.
They would investigate the motive of the accuser.
Okay, so we're again looking at the accusers and how they are seen. Oh, gee, I'm sorry, I skipped the text. We're gonna go back and take a look at the text. How are
We actually had such an event at the Fairlawn Jewish Center many years ago, where the executive director was accused of assaulting a child, and it turned out the accuser had done something like this a number of times in the past.
wow. And so did the synagogue leadership take action?
Did.
They
Yes,
did. Okay, well, that's good. That's good to hear. But was it difficult to take action? Were there those who would say, "Oh, I don't believe it," or "It doesn't happen in Jewish places," or
That was the initial.
we're losing the audio, Carol. We just lost the audio.
I'm sorry. It had devastating effects on the person who was accused falsely.
All right. I'll see you guys later.
Okay. I realized I'm sorry, I had left. I did want to go to one more before we went to the modern one. So let me actually share the screen, which will also have an effect, as we will see on the modern one. No, wrong. I'm sorry, I got to stop the share. I want to take a look at one more. Sorry, that was my mistake. I want to take a look at here, this one. Okay, share. This is the question. When an accusation is brought, how is the person who is the victim seen? What happens to the victim? Now, in modern times, what have we seen when women have and men have made accusations? What often happens?
They blame the woman.
They blame the woman, right? In other words, the victim is blamed. The one great example we have in the Bible of this accusation and blaming is Joseph. Admittedly, he's a male, but something that I had not really thought about very closely until I saw this text. This is a recent text, okay, written just a couple of years ago by a British woman who has studied As you know, there are a lot of advanced places for women to study. Even in the Orthodox world, they don't exactly call them rabbis, but they give them different names, and they study the text in the same way as in a rabbinical school traditionally for males. This is written by a woman, Miriam Lurie, who looks at the story of Joseph. So here's the question. Okay, remember the story of Joseph, right? Joseph is alone in the house of the wife of Potiphar, and she says, "Come lie with me," and he doesn't. She grabs it and rips his coat, and he runs out, right? So who's the victim here?
He is Joseph
Joseph is the victim.
Joseph.
And who's the accuser?
Potiphar.
Potiphar's wife. In the ways we have seen in the Bible and in other traditional texts, we know there is a tendency to blame the victim, right?
Mhm.
Right? Look at Dina, right? She went out. We know why she went out, right? Okay. So what happens, and I was very impressed with this because it talks about Joseph, okay? And what she does, okay, let's look at the text and then we'll look at her commentary. He left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. When she, Potiphar's wife, saw that he had left it in her hand and fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, okay, here is the first time that we're hearing about what happened from the perpetrator's point of view, right? Potiphar's wife. Look, her husband, had to bring a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed aloud, and when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside. First telling of the story. She kept his garment beside her till his master came home. Then she said to her husband, she's going to explain the same thing. Now, notice the first time she explained it, went to a very long explanation. She said, the Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to dally with me, but when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside. When his master heard the story that his wife had told him, namely, we're retelling the story again. Thus and so your slave did to me, he was furious. Now, what's going to note several things. The story changes based upon who she's talking to and what she's saying. And we're talking again about the victim of harassment and how the victim is described by the perpetrator. Okay, in 7 short verses, the story is told no less than 5 times. The Torah's account, right? When she saw that, all right, the wife of Eshed means wife of Potiphar's rapid assessment, the story she tells herself, the wife of Potiphar to the people of her household, the wife of Potiphar to her husband, and what is Potiphar? You know, again, somebody says something, but what does somebody actually hear? So what the author of this text is trying to do is to describe the text, but I see it as well as this question as to how is the perpetrator describe the victim. And you'll notice that there are different stories. There are different stories, right? In her rapid assessment of the crime scene, the wife of Potiphar realizes that there are 2 incriminating details, the garment and the fact that he went outside. Her panicked address to the servant changes the details. He left his garment with me, and he got away and fled outside. But more pernicious is her opener. Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. What is that saying?
A fault.
Her husband.
Whose fault is it?
The husband.
The husband. And this person that the husband brought in is what type of a person? Does he have a name?
No, he's a Hebrew.
Oh, the immigrants. And we know that the immigrants are just, they do sexual crimes, right? Immigrants cause sexual crimes. That's what she is saying, right? A Hebrew to dally with us. You know, one of those hot Hebrews who just wants to take advantage of us, right? But more pernicious is her opener. Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. He is Potiphar, and his wife appeals to the special grudges that her servants may have against their master, bringing them on her side. In other words, she's trying to gain confidence with other people. You know, hey, it's us against them, right? The use of Hebrew appeals to undertones of anti-Semitism that we see elsewhere in the story. Hey, he's got a name. And he was brought to dally with us, creates a block of solidarity against the common enemy, where naturally the servants may have sided with their fellow servant. Now she's dividing people, but I'm reading into this as, oh, to dally, you know, right, again, if you don't like immigrants and you don't like a certain group of people, this is an old story where you complain that, you know, that they take advantage of us sexually. You know, a clear way of making it the victim to blame, you know. When Potiphar does get home, he is treated to a different story. The words ha'eved ha'ivri are used, creating a double distance of class and race between Potiphar and Joseph. This is a jarring note of an accusation, whom you brought to our house. The account of Joseph fleeing is simplified to amplify his guilt. And once again, she references the story of her crying out to compound the portrait of victimhood. I am the victim, right? Not him. I am the victim. I'm the perpetrator, but I'm the one being victimized, right? And this is, she really goes pretty far in this next one, I have to say. I thought it was, yeah, it's really crazy, but okay. But my favorite, what does Potiphar says, right? He says, when his master, Potiphar, heard the story that his wife told him, and what does he say? Thus and so your slave did to me, he was furious. Lemor, kadavarim ha'ela asa li avdecha, right? Avdecha, sorry. He heard words and words. The phrase "kedavarim ha'ela," he said, you know, thus and such. What's she reading into it? We get the impression that Potiphar does not believe her story. Potiphar, a eunuch, according to Ibn Ezra, all right, she's following some traditional views here, may well have experienced his wife's explorations beyond his bed in the past. Maybe Potiphar knew that his wife, you know, wasn't so pure. Yes, we are told that Potiphar is furious, but could it not be not Joseph, but his wife who he's angry with? You know, this is, I mean, again, reading into it, it would track the prison he escorted Joseph to is a very gentrified prison for Pharaoh's own prisoners. In other words, when Joseph is thrown into jail, he's in jail with the top, you know, he's in one of these high level, he's not being thrown into a dungeon, he's with these high level guys. And not only that, oh, where does she say that? I'm trying, there's one other statement that she makes. I'm trying to find. Okay, so the phrase "kedavarim ha'ela" could easily translate to yada yada yada. Oh yeah, I heard that story before. We get the impression that Potiphar does not believe it, all right? So here, notice in the story of Joseph itself, what do we have? Sexual harassment, the victim being seen as the aggressor, as the guilty party, the perpetrator accusing the victim in negative words, you know, this woman was, you know, you would say in modern times, this woman was a slut, this woman, you know, was asking for it, that sort of thing. But when we read the story of Joseph, we can see all of those characteristics. I thought this was just so fascinating. Normally when we read the story, we don't read it that closely and look at these different statements that are made by both Potiphar and his wife, and the way she changes them and uses certain words. Yeah, Carol, you were going to comment?
I I was taught, as were you by Dr. Gordon, that this Joseph story originated and was told in Egypt. So there is a Joseph story in Egypt. And what I was wondering, is it just the Egyptian story, just the story of Joseph and his coat and his brothers? Or does it also contain this sexual harassment story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife? Do you know that? Do you remember?
Are you asking the question as to which of the classic
How much of the,
the classic different streams, different texts within the Bible does this come from? I don't have an
Yes.
answer for that.
I know, but I'm
In other
curious
words,
about
who the question you're asking, who wrote this and when and why? Is this the same author with the same intent as the other stories of Joseph, or does this come from another source to look at it at a slightly different perspective? I think that's what you're asking. Yes.
Yes, that's
I
yes.
I don't have an answer for that, and honestly, I don't have the resources to look that up. That there
Yeah.
are Bibles that are printed in different colors with the different sources. Again, Carol's making reference to the source critical theory that says that the Bible is not a unitary document, but there were 4 documents that were later on edited into one document, and we see specific, and we can recognize the 4 documents in many, both grammatical, thematic, and other ways. I don't have it. That's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. I'm not sure I can find. I may or may not be able to. Okay. Any other comments? We're just about out of time. We'll go back to that modern story. We'll begin with that next time and look at some modern issues with sexual harassment in synagogues. Okay. Any final comments or questions?
Hi, Jack.
Okay, well, good to see all of you this morning. We'll continue and move on to modern times in detail next week. Okay.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good
Bye.
week.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Rabbi. Have a good day, everyone.
You too.